element, how questions are asked is equally important as the information gained. And today's session, the last in this series on equitable knowledge production, is about honing in to the specific changes we are seeing or need to see in order to support more equitable research and evaluation processes. Today, we have an amazing lineup of speakers to discuss promoting equitable knowledge production. Johanneke de Hoo comes from the Dutch Policy Evaluation and Operations Department, where she coordinates policy research and evaluations in the area of humanitarian aid and migration. Prior to that, she ran the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Eastern Europe Department. Zaki Ullah is a founding member of Glow Consultants, a consultancy firm based in Islamabad with a focus on monitoring, evaluation, and research. And Zaki's area of speciality is monitoring and evaluation, quality assurance, and data analysis. His research also includes bridging the sector's knowledge gap in terms of developing a framework to measure localization impact at the community level. Dr. Alistair Cook is coordinator of the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Programme and senior fellow at the School of International Studies in Singapore. He led the drafting of the ASEAN Disaster Resilience Outlook and co-authored the article Knowledge Management and Humanitarian Organisations in the Asia Pacific, Practices, Challenges and Future Pathways. Catherine Gill is a director in DFAT's Humanitarian Division. She leads humanitarian and development partnerships with Australian NGOs and multilateral organisations. Ms. Gill has over 20 years' experience working on Australia's Foreign Policy and Development Cooperation Programme. And Dr. Puji Pujiono is a social worker who serves as a senior advisor to the Pujiono Centre, an Indonesian local NGO focusing on disaster response and humanitarian knowledge management. He has played key roles in the formation of Indonesian disaster management law and ASEAN's regional agreement on disaster management and emergency response. So as you can see, we have a wonderful lineup of panelists, and I'm sure you're excited to hear from them. So let's get into the questions. And just to start off one with everyone in the audience, we wanted to ask, what is one word that comes to mind or phrase that comes to mind when you think of the current humanitarian knowledge and evidence landscape? And as a reminder, knowledge and evidence is a large field, and it can include many activities such as individual or collective reflection, monitoring and evaluation, research, facilitation, and training. So please type that into the chat. A quick reminder as well on how we can ask questions to our panelists. So there will be a Q&A later where you can raise your hand and we will call you to speak. As our panelists are talking, you can also type your question into the chat box. And you can also ask your question anonymously by accessing the Mentimeter link, which I think Pam is going to pop into the chat. So just for the first round of questions to our panelists now, and before you answer my specific question, I'd love for you to think about that one word or phrase that comes to mind when you think about the humanitarian knowledge and evidence landscape. My first question is to Alistair, and we haven't got Al for the whole session, unfortunately, so we are keen to hear from you in this question. There are a lot of students and academics here. What do you think the role of academics is in supporting more equitable knowledge production in the humanitarian sector? And do you have any recommendations in supporting more equitable production?
Thanks, Madeline, and thanks to the team at the Humanitarian Advisory Group for organising this session. It's one that I think is very important. And so my word would be atomised. And I say that because what we've seen is the proliferation of information across all sectors, not just the humanitarian sector. And we've also seen the development of messaging platforms and multiple avenues to communicate with one another. While finding more accessible methods of communication is to be welcomed, we've become more fractured, more atomized, and at the same time, far more connected. So it's quite a challenge in how we communicate. So it means that there are better ways to communicate, but often they're not necessarily linking up together. So we need to be much more proactive, I think, and considered in how we learn from our experiences to inform the sector and to ensure that it is essentially people-centered, to assist us in capturing the experiences of communities as well as other stakeholders to help avoid them being lost in the cracks of the information landscape. And I think this is where academia and the research community at large, itself now more diverse than ever, plays an important role. So with the second question about what can we be doing in this sector to be supporting a more equitable knowledge production or a knowledge landscape, however we want to look at it, is that I think the first one is that academic and research community has largely been underappreciated, but it does have an important role to play in supporting such a move to a more equitable humanitarian system. And I think it's particularly important in our collective ability to reflect on humanitarian efforts, engage multiple stakeholders, as well as pursue ethical research investigations to inform what we now often refer to as evidence-based decision-making. My comments are more focused really on my experience in disaster settings in the region, so I'll just touch on a couple of those points in the brief time I've got. So the first one is the institutes of higher learning, so universities as well as further education colleges, have an important role to play because they are repositories of knowledge and teaching the next generation. They offer the humanitarian community a site for engagement with local affected communities as they are based in or near them and consist of a mixture of local and international researchers, drawing on diverse range of experience. There are also some limitations to the role this community can play because they face funding challenges, heavy teaching workloads and administrative tasks, which we need to be mindful of. And in the Asia Pacific, through some of the studies that we've done, we've seen the humanitarian community invest in knowledge and reflection within humanitarian organizations, but we have so far yet to withstand the test of time with these. And less attention is focused on partnerships with the academic and research community. It's not to say it doesn't exist. There are several examples in the region, and many here will know of them. But I think it's important that we bridge this gap and bring it to scale so that from university projects to engaging external consultancies like HAG. Yet the challenge often is that the expectation is for the academic and research community to bid for periodic and short-term projects. This is often repeated critique, whereas longer-term and sustainable partnerships have had much less focus. So what can we do about it? And that's sort of where I want to give a couple of inputs here on where do we go from here. And one example, I think, or entry point, are in the technical and professional courses that train students in the next generation in particular issue areas. We could invest in more partnerships to support capstone projects, informed dissertation projects to have real-world impact as an option for students to choose from through these partnerships. This would support the next generation of humanitarians by recognizing and engaging student-led projects such as these. A second area would be to invest in a research network at source in the countries and communities affected by disaster, for example. Again, while there are a number of professional research networks, a greater focus on empowering local institutes of higher learning should be prioritized for the development of sustainable knowledge hubs. This could be done through twinning efforts between institutions. And again, while there are several efforts, it really does need to be brought to scale across the region. An investment in such upstream efforts, I think, would have a wider impact as humanitarian organizations often experience high staff turnover and necessarily are operations heavy in its organizational culture. So through the engagement of institutes of higher learning, I think it would be an important way to address this gap. And it's been made more accessible, as we've witnessed, for those who are connected to the internet during the COVID pandemic, making these connections much easier now than they would have been imagined in the past. And I think this would facilitate us in building a sustainable and inclusive humanitarian knowledge hub as part of a wider community of practice. And I think this would complement humanitarian operations, where often people see reflection and analysis as often administrative tasks, whereas engaging the research and academic community, these are bread and butter issues for us, which have our attention. And so that is our added value, I think, in in dealing with a shift, a proactive shift to a more equitable humanitarian system. And I'll stop there. I don't want to talk too long. Thanks very much, Madeline.
Thanks so much, Al. That was really a great insight, and great to hear some really practical steps for connecting research partners with NGOs and donors and the humanitarian sector. So I just wanted to go to Catherine Johannica and ask you both, what do you think the role of donors is to support more equitable knowledge production? And I'll ask Catherine first that question.
Terrific. Thanks, Madeline. And hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you, Hag, for convening it. And thank you to all the panelists for joining today. It's great. My word in the chat was fragmented. I think there is a lot of knowledge production all over the world, both in the global north and global south, but how that knowledge is then applied and used, I think, is where we're see significant gaps. Generally, I think, similar to some of the issues that Al raised, feel that it's dominated by the global north. We need to do a lot more as donors to meaningfully understand, promote, and use global south knowledge. And there's a few ideas we have around roles for donors in this. That part of that is, as donors, we have a few different things in our power. Some of it is finance, and some of it is or equitable knowledge production. So one of the ways we're doing it is specifically this program. So we're investing in this Humanitarian Horizons Programme. It's a multi-year sustained investment that we've made with the Humanitarian Advisory Group in localisation, and this is one of the streams under the project. So the project itself is embedding, local partnerships in producing that knowledge, and I'm really pleased that some of those partners are online today, either as panelists or participants. And so, we'd be really interested in your perspective as to the extent to which this investment is promoting that equitable knowledge production. We've got a few recent examples I can point to. I would say, with lots of caveats, it's not enough, but we've recently done, for instance, an evaluation of some work we're doing with Australian NGO partners, a few of whom I can see online today, in Bangladesh, looking at support there over a number of years. And there was a very deliberate decision right from the outset, despite a lot of constraints in working with the Rohingya refugee population and some of the restrictions around that in terms of regulations, is that we really wanted to have Rohingya members on the evaluation team, and not just as interpreters, actually as meaningful members of the team, just because they bring unique insights. I think their engagement in taking perspectives and sharing knowledge from the Rohingya community would be unparalleled. It's just information we wouldn't otherwise have. Another one, and I'll just do a little plug, if you can see that, is it's not strictly humanitarian, but it's in my program. So I just want to mention it briefly because I just am so excited about this. This is a program through our volunteer program where we've got First Nations pathways. And this particular initiative is going to build the sharing of knowledge production between Indigenous Australians working, protecting our reefs and our forests and our lands, with Solomon Islands leaders, women leaders in conservation. And one of the main objectives of the exchange is to produce knowledge, share knowledge, see what's relevant between those Indigenous communities. So I think that's a really good example how we can use our advocacy and our financing to be driving that knowledge production. But as I said, with caveats, there's so much more we can be doing, and we really need to tackle a lot of the barriers. So we need to create those opportunities for more global south sort of voices to be shaping and leading research and evaluation, not just be participants in it. I think we need to look really hard at our own practices as some donors, as issues around compliance, risk management, the languages that we use to communicate and produce that knowledge, accessibility across a whole range of issues there. I think we've discussed risk sharing a lot in the humanitarian sector, but I don't think we're quite there yet. There's a lot of hard barriers in terms of the sorts of compliance and regulations that we have in place as donors who are typically investing taxpayers' money. We need to be very deliberate about allocating resources to support local partners to deliver. So to mandate them with meaningful roles, allocate budget, create feedback mechanisms, invest in that capability development, and really ask ourselves because we probably invest a bit more, I think it's fair to say, in evaluations than in original research. But when we're doing those evaluations, you know, we're writing terms of reference, we're setting the parameters, who's defining that, who's reviewing the terms of reference, who's shaping the methodology, how, if at all, are we creating opportunities for those local voices to really be shaping, because it's really the terms of reference that will define what knowledge we produce from that evaluation practice. And then I just wanted to finish by saying, you know, one of the things that framed all our work as humanitarians is that accountability to affected population. And I think we don't ask enough when we're thinking about research and evaluation, who's going to benefit from it, who we acknowledge in the production, how we communicate outcomes, you know, that loop back to affected communities who are so often actually providing the content for it all, but we don't acknowledge that enough. So that's an Australian perspective, but I'm really interested to hear Johanneka's perspective as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. There was so much in there, and great to hear about that amazing project that you explained. That sounds really amazing, working with Indigenous communities in the Solomon Islands in Australia. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to hear more about that project in time. On to Johanneka.
Thank you very much, Madeline, and thank you very much, Catherine. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for organizing this HAG. So I was asked actually to share some of my personal experiences and some of the challenges I encountered. I just finalized a big policy evaluation on Dutch humanitarian assistance, on the humanitarian assistance given by the Netherlands since 2015. I have a background in development, but purely from a donor's perspective. So probably some of the things that Catherine just mentioned will come along in my short presentation. So in that evaluation, we decided to focus on the theme of localization, not because we talked to local voices, but because we thought this was a logical step, as the Netherlands put localization as a priority since the Grand Bargain on paper in their policy. So when we developed the terms of reference of this big evaluation in 2020, we never talked once to local voices or voices from the South. I must admit that. My input at the time came from the policy department in The Hague, a few Dutch embassies in the South, probably some of our national local workers at those embassies, existing research, and Dutch NGOs. So the research questions we developed on effectiveness and relevance were entirely developed from a donor's perspective, and not at all from the perspective of affected populations or communities. So this global North donors perspective, what is it about? It's all about accountability and about learning. Finding evidence, as mentioned by my former speakers, to support the policy decisions made, acquire the right knowledge to motivate funding allocations and to motivate certain diplomatic interventions, and also to defend a predictable policy and to protect the budget to be sustained for the next couple of years. So basically, at the time in 2020, all the donor wanted to know was if the needs of the affected population were met in line with their priorities. But with their priorities, it would mean the donors' priorities and not so much the priorities of the affected populations. So I can say that these priorities on paper don't differ too much, because the policy mentioned it should be timely, needs-based humanitarian assistance guided by humanitarian principles, supporting locally led aid, supporting innovation and nexus between development and humanitarian assistance. But I actually only started to reflect on input from the South or from the global South when trying to answer the research questions that were already formed and defined. So what we did is we started working with, firstly, international consultants who managed in-country consultants who would visit then the local actors or the local partners who were working, with country-based pooled funds, funded indirectly by the Netherlands, or with UN agencies, or with the different international NGOs who are under the Dutch Relief Alliance. So, and then of course, many challenges occurred because we found it difficult to access the knowledge from the Global South. And why was that? Basically because it takes time and a solid preparation. It takes also, I think, a pre-existing network of quality in-country consultants. And we didn't put as much time to contact or to select those. Whereas we did put a lot of time in selecting the international consultants to help us. So that's like kind of a strange feature of how we went about. And the other challenge we encountered that it takes time to speak the same language. And I'm not only talking about English, French, or any other language, but to know what kind of language the donor needs and to know in what kind of language the affected community speaks. It's very complicated and you need to talk together to define and edge out possible differences of interpretation. And mostly because effectiveness in terms of whose objectives. I mean, this was already defined in the terms of reference, and relevance in terms of whose priorities, already defined by the Global North. So my word that I typed in just now was trust. It takes trust and confidence at all levels. For example, were the in-country consultants well received by our big international partners when we asked them to visit their local partners, were they received as well as I was later on when I visited just for a short-term mission with an international, what was were they able to talk to the right persons in the right communities? I have no idea, and I should have, I think. So and I think they were perhaps much more better prepared. They were certainly much better prepared to talk to the communities and everyone, but what was then the added value of me and an international consultant to visit as well? And lastly, it takes a reflection on the ethical constraints in terms of security. With security, we had Yemen, Syria, and South Sudan as our country case studies. And we were, of course, not able to go everywhere. So basically, it was the in-country consultants who did lots of work for us in South Sudan and in Yemen and in Syria. And in terms of security, but as well during the COVID times, we had to reflect on that, on what we asked from in-country consultants and what we asked from ourselves. So I think, honestly, we could have done a much better job to navigate these challenges. Reluctantly, I conclude that in my evaluation and in my research, the knowledge of the Global North mattered much more than the knowledge of the Global South. I'm honest about it, but I also I feel this is something that we have to work on more within the system, with our partners and within our own donor agency. I think change will happen gradually, not in one night, but we have to hold ourselves to account, our international partners to account, and invest in meaningful capacities in the South. And, and then I mean in meaningful partnerships with existing capacities in the South, working directly with the North and the South. It seems like we're two opposite forces, but we come from different perspectives. And I think it is a lot of work. It needs work to make sure that we talk the same language. So I would like to stop right there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannika, and thank you for your honesty, because I really think it's these honest discussions that bring about change and really being able to reflect on things truthfully and the situation at hand. So I wanted to go over to Zaki now. And coming from a consultancy group, Glow Consultants, what do you think the role is of consultancy groups? And I know Johannika has just mentioned how she's worked with some, and also think tanks in supporting more equitable knowledge production.
Thank you very much, Madeline, and hello, everyone. Before I provide my inputs, I must acknowledge that some of the concerns or aspects mentioned by the donors over here already on this panel, I mean, really resonates, and maybe it will be also covered, or I'll touch base on it. But this is very good that I can see as a person coming from a global south, that those concerns or the issues, the challenges we face are actually now being kind of heard, and these are in the knowledge of the donors. And definitely, as John K said, maybe it's not like overnight, but with the passage of time, definitely we'll be able to overcome. So, and before I answer your question, Madeline, the first thing you asked initially from everyone was the one word. So the one word, considering the current way of the research production, comes to my mind is more like of a traditional top-down approach, where things are trickled down from the top, from the donors, maybe intermediary, and then it comes to the partner in the global south. So this is something comes to my mind, and I must appreciate this is something I believe is slowly and gradually changing. At least people are now acknowledging it, and people are moving forward from it with some good alternative ways. Okay, now to answer your question, and this question I'll tackle it more from a perspective of a partner based in global south. So what I can definitely, a one-liner, I can say there's a huge potential still exists for the local, the global south partners to contribute to the researches. At the moment, I think the potential is not utilized to the extent it should be utilized. And why I said maybe I can go on a classical sort of a research cycle, starting from the agenda setting or the TURs. Generally, we see there's very limited role for the global south partners. And again, I'll come back to this point. Maybe this is one of the aspects where the contribution, obtaining the contribution or inputs from the global south partners in a traditional way, it's a bit challenging as well. Even the intermediaries who comes in, maybe they also have a limited role, because the client organization, the donor organization, have already set up that agenda. Maybe this is something that the challenge maybe the intermediary international research firms also face. Maybe not to that extent as the global south partners face it, but maybe this is something they face as well. So moving on from there, then the other area is the research methodology and design. I think this is very, I mean, if we want, the partnership wants, it can be easily accommodated, where the global south partners can come together with the international organization, and they can come up with the research methodology for that particular research. And we can see that this is happening in some of the researchers where we are getting engaged. But again, this is something needs to be done as a sector-wide, and more organizations should start practicing it, because I'm not saying that everyone is practicing it. There are some practices, we are engaged on those practices as well. Maybe Hague is here, let me appreciate them as well by name, because it's good practice. So I appreciate them. Definitely we get a good say in even shaping up the researches and the design work of methodology as well. Now moving from design, then is the data collection. And I think for data collection, I think the global south partners generally don't have any complaint or any concern. I think they are well covered here. They are well engaged in the data collection. Now there could be counter argument to it as well, that why this is happening. But definitely this is the strength for the reason why they are engaged in the research for first place. I mean, for many international organizations. So, I mean, data collection, definitely it is primarily done by the global south partners, and rightly so. I think this is good. But then when we move to the analysis part of it, again, then we see that the role of the global south partners reduced, if not completely taken out, but this is very limited. Sometimes it's only the kind of final version of the document that you can get a chance to review and provide your input, or maybe the second sort of a draft. So the analyses are formulated not in consultation or direct engagement with the South Global South partners. General practice, I think there's a greater role, and it will definitely enrich the analysis and the recommendations coming out of the researches. Now, there's one other aspect, and I don't see this aspect is much talked about, but this is something very important. And I'm taking the advantage of, the partner from Global North and the donors part of this whole discussion over here. That's the when we say equitable knowledge production, we should also take something, consider the beyond the knowledge productions. The data that is generated through that knowledge production process, we have this clause, and which is pretty much a standard clause in pretty much all the contracts, that all the data ownership and the research product ownership remains with the client. I think this, and I do understand there's a lot of this data protection, data privacy aspects also going on, and that discussion is also a lot taking place at the moment. So I'm aware of that discussion, but at the same time, I believe that this is the clause, and I'm using the word here because pretty much with one word here and there, it's pretty much there in all your contracts. And this is, I think, a limiting factor for the local organization then to utilize that particular research for further coming up with further researches out of it. Maybe a small pieces. If a bigger research is done, maybe a small piece can be done. Because one of the limiting factor for the local organization is the resources to go and collect a lot of data and spend that resources. So if that resources are already spent, maybe this is the time for the donors to consider, and this clause can be amended in a way where we make sure that the privacy and protection, all those aspects are also covered. But at the same time, we provide some flexibility to the local partner that they can utilize this data for further researches as well and contribute to the sector. So I'll just stop here for this round. Definitely look forward to answer any question from the audience and maybe later in the discussion. So over back to you, Madeline.
Thank you so much, Zaki. And it was really interesting to hear the breakdown between each of the different paths of going through a project. We're now really interested to hear from Pak Puji about the role of NGOs in equitable knowledge production. So over to you, Pak Puji.
Thank you, Madeline. Greetings, everyone. Peace be upon all of us. I'm Puji Pujiono, as it was introduced, from Indonesia. I would respond to that question, the role of NGOs in the equitable production of knowledge. Start with the contextualizing it first. One, I think in Indonesia, and perhaps it's not very different in the rest of Global South, we do have the tradition of building knowledge. But our tradition, the way of working, may not necessarily symmetrical with the culture in the Global North. That's one. Number two, that the field of humanitarian are not necessarily the field that consciously set aside resources, energy to build knowledge compared to other sectors. It most likely like an assessment and things like that, but really, unless it's really dedicated effort, usually it is overlooked. The third one, also reality, that research and knowledge building is not a line of business that brings you lots of money. So it is not attractive as such. Now, given that context, for the last at least 5 years in the case of Pujiono centers, we've gone through different kind of modus operandi that would illustrate the role of NGO, local NGOs. Pujiono Center being very few, if not, well, I would not say the only, but really one among very few organizations that focus on knowledge building. We have gone through a sort of work that was commissioned to us in which we work like a manual labor for data. Simply we're collecting data. That's it. The term of reference, the priority, methodology are set somewhere else. And we just receive a survey sheet and we collect the information. Manual labor and data collection. Now, the other end of the spectrum is a partnership with colleagues from other places, in which we conceptualize the research out of the needs that we identified together. And then we shape the research, the methodology, the frame for analysis jointly, and then interpret the meaning of the research jointly, and publish it, and actually distribute the credit where it's due, including to local actors. So this is the spectrum, the range of partnership that we have gone through. Now, in between, there are some other things, of course, in which local NGO like us in Global South, we absorb the risks that are inherent in the knowledge building undertaking of Global North. As Johannika was saying, there are situations, there are times where Global North researchers may not have access to the ground for one reason or another. Then we local NGOs absorb that risk, we undertook it, and we absorb the threat, the hazard that associated with the data. And then we also act as interpreter of culture, of the frame of thinking, or simply language, of the two worlds that otherwise would be disconnected. So local NGOs in the unique position of having that access to the both worlds, if you like. And thus we could interpret the facts, the assumption, the conclusion, and what's not. And there are also times that our role would be like a tip X. You know, tip X is a corrective solution, right? So there are times where the Global North researchers and enterprises would undertake research and actually came out with false conclusion, if you like, or just different turn in the analysis. And then we are there to do the correction, the corrective action by reinterpreting, by putting more context and taking forward. And then finally, and the other end of the spectrum that I shared with you earlier, and I would like to acknowledge here our partnership with the Humanitarian Advisory Group, in which I think it is exemplary, because from the beginning, we already agreed that we start this with respect and trust. And we explicitly saying that we acknowledge the strength of one another. So in the case of Humanitarian Advisory Group, we started in 2018, in which HAG is the one that bid the project, and we become the follower. And the next time around, we turn the table around. The General Center become the one who bid the project, and then Humanitarian Advisory Group become the supporter, right? But beyond that, out of the series of research, I think I would dare say that in the case of Indonesia, at least, when it comes to localization, General Center has been the one that diligently follow this line of research. And just to share with you, Madeline and colleagues, how far a trust-based relationship could push the issue. On the basis of that trust-based partnership that we designed together, we implemented together, we own the conclusion. We own the recommendation. And General Center used the findings to stimulate conversation in the country. It allows us the flexibility to pivot from basic research on localization into response to COVID and establish a national network. And when the momentum of the pandemic actually slowed down, we transformed that into the Indonesian Development Humanitarian Alliance, using as a foundation the findings of our research. And now it become a nationwide 7 largest humanitarian networks that actually voicing the voice of the local, if you like, Indonesia. So there, Madeline, I illustrated the range of partnership, the bad, the good, and the ugly of it, but also the promise that it could be the beginning, a new way of doing business in this area. Over to you, Madeline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Puji. And yeah, really great overview of the role of NGOs and local NGOs in equitable knowledge production and how you've worked in the sector. I just wanted to turn now to the audience to see if there's any questions, but also to run through some of those, I guess, some of those words or phrases that come to mind when we're thinking about equitable knowledge production. So we've got donor-driven, top-sided, fragmented, bureaucratic, lack of learning, concentrated in power, bias listening and hearing, learning from disaster, interest-driven, knowledge production. So I think we're seeing a bit of a common thread here in terms of, I think, that it's very much top-down. It's very much driven by the global north. And so I think what we're really trying to do today is to come up with some recommendations on how we can sort of shift that narrative a bit. And then we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll go to Chris first. Chris, did you want to talk or bring up your question? I don't think we can hear you. So I'll just read it out for you. So this is a question for Al and Puji. How can universities or other institutions share better the lessons learnt from past disasters so that we can better share the lessons with current stakeholders?
Al, would you like to go first? It goes by age, you know.
I think Al might have actually popped off, so I'll put that to you, Puji, if possible.
Oh, okay. Well, as Al was saying, university actually, the way I look at it anyway, really the bastion of the knowledge building, you know. They live, they are mandated, they are paid to do that, right? Unfortunately, unfortunately, again, humanitarian field is a field that's constantly changing. One is that. Two is deeply contextualized. So by and large, I think I see that the research and knowledge building through and in university tend to be scattered. It hardly dictated by, for example, having a deep conversation with humanitarian workers on the ground and really ask what really matters in their work and use that as a guiding post, if you like, to build the agenda of research in the university. So I feel that there's a disconnect between university as an established institutions and the practitioners on the ground, largely because of the first three reasons that I shared with you earlier. That research is not a natural, and not genetic in the DNA of humanitarian operation, I suppose. It requires one step further to encourage research. Number two, many of the experience, knowledge accumulated through operations do not naturally fit into the framework of scientific inquiries. And that become a building block because then it's not intuitively become a research that is interesting and admissible scientifically. But that also highlights why and how important university is in extending itself and its perspective and its generosity in many ways to absorbing this phenomenon that are growing on the ground that are unstructured into something that could be elevated into a normative knowledge that then could be taught to other person, could be learned as good practices. Without that, these good practices remain to be pockets of events that cannot be arranged to produce trend projection in an educated way. So there you go. One is a condemnation to the university, but number two is a calling, and number three is invitation for cooperation. Over to you, Madeline.
Thanks so much, Puji. That's the great points. We do have another question in the chat from Professor Vinod Menon. Did you want to speak to your question, Professor?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madeline. I just was wondering, why is the documentation of data-led evidence of impactful exemplars of case studies by the NGOs in the Global South missing in the creation and dissemination of knowledge by donors, in spite of a large body of knowledge which has been created by evaluations and case studies of locally led adaptation projects by many of the outstanding NGOs with a lot of dedicated grassroots level workers. And if I can also mention a supplementary question as an add-on, I feel that there is a need in terms of knowledge management in the humanitarian sector to have some kind of a mega portal which really looks at linking the digital literacy of the accumulated knowledge in the field of disaster management, disaster risk reduction over the last several decades. In spite of having Prevention Web and many other websites by many agencies, there is a need for some kind of a mega portal which can actually really look at as a single window source. Maybe that's something for you to examine. Thank you.
Some great ideas there. And I might throw it to Catherine or Johannika about the first question. So why is the documentation of data-led evidence missing from the Global South?
Catherine, do you want to go ahead or should I give it a try? Okay, so I think, actually what we did in the big policy evaluation, we tried to, we commissioned like a literature study on localization and on existing evidence. And I think that's one of the better, it's a good product, but the limitation was that it only looked at literature in the English language. So basically, and then I think you narrow down and you limit the evidence you're looking at. Basically, when you're talking about, like the data collected by national NGOs, there's a huge hunger, I would say, from Northern donors to come up with the right examples on how good it is to localize or to locally lead humanitarian action. And the problem with, for example, one of the conclusions of that literature study was that there's a lot of individual positive examples, which points to a trend of evidence on the added value of localization. But it's not yet, and they refer to it as anecdotal evidence, which is not good, I think, for a donor. If we hear that, like it's very difficult to sell it to a parliament or to the general public. We only need positive examples, of how good it is to localize. And the other challenge I feel is that the whole discussion about localization is also tainted a bit. There's a moral, I would say, we all think it's the best thing to do, so don't talk about it too much. Basically, that's also a little bit the challenge we face. How should we, ask for evidence on localization where we all know, if it would be, I'm just trying to turn around the roles. For example, if in the Netherlands we would have a big disaster, we would really invite international support to come and help us when there's, for example, giant floods. But in the end, I think the Dutch people really understand that they would like to be in the lead, and they think they are the best to lead because they've been living in this country for generations. So basically, that's the example we use in our discussions and debates with Parliament. Perhaps I'm talking too much, but that's one part of the answer to your question, sir.
No, that's such an interesting reflection. Thanks, Johannika. I'm just going to do one more question. I'm going to go to Youssef. You've had your hand up for a while, and then we might need to move on to the second round of questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. Maybe my point is related to donors. In fact, always we say that we have knowledge, but what we lack is how to learn from this knowledge, how to operationalize the knowledge we have. We have many monitoring and evaluation reports, and always we report same recommendations, but nothing take place, nothing happen in reality. In fact, we are a third-party monitoring and evaluation company based in Turkey, and we have many assignments in the region, but always we have the same issue. always repeated mistakes by international NGOs, local NGOs, or by donors. My question is that I don't know who will answer this question. Donors, they are in a very, they have the power. I mean, number one, and when we talk about the power, because they have fund, etc., they have the power. Local NGOs, international NGOs, they are not brave enough to point out to some mistakes or to put the pressure on donors, because this, I mean, funding might be affected with this donor or that donor, if it is institutional or non-institutional donors as well. My question is, who can put a pressure on donors? Universities, research centers, who can put them so we can push them to change their attitude and behavior? Again, they talk about localization, but when we come to reality, it is very difficult to localize because there are many conditions, many procedures to go through, and nothing happened. This is because they are, and in case they would like to, they have really serious intention to localize, they are in a good position to push, to put the pressure on local NGOs, international NGOs, but they don't do this. So who can put the pressure on donors? Because always they are the source of problems and they are the source of solutions as well. The second point, maybe we feel that there is localization also towards local consultancies. There are some international NGOs, they are trying just to give consultancies to local consultancies in the region. I'm talking about the Middle East. I don't know if it's the same in other countries. So do you think that in case international NGOs or donors, they put criteria, if there are local consultants, if there are local consultancies, etc., and as service providers, this will enhance localization? Thank you very much.
Catherine, you're nodding. Did you want to try and respond to a bit of that?
Yeah, I can try. Thank you for the question. They're really good questions.
Thanks,
In terms of who can pressure donors, well, ultimately donors, as public donors, are accountable to their ministers, to the parliament, to the taxpayers. So we actually do get a lot of pressure in terms of good practice. I can see there are members of the Australian NGO community online and, you know, the Peak Body Coordination Group. So we do actually get held to account by our partners, our NGO partners, and by civil society, as well as our own ministers. But you're right, it is hard. There is a massive power imbalance. Let's, you know, call it what it is. Also say, as an Australian government donor, you know, it's easier for Australian NGOs to access us and lobby us and hold us to account. It's much less easy for an NGO from, particularly from an affected country that we might be working with. We wouldn't always have a direct relationship with them. I think there are a few hooks though. You know, most donors have signed up to a range of good practice frameworks, including, you know, most of the major donors are members, for instance, of the Good Humanitarian Donorship Group, which has a regular interface with a range of NGOs and civil society reps through the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. Again, most of the very major donors in the system are signatories to the Grand Bargain, and the Grand Bargain has some very specific commitments in it on localization. We're not doing well enough. We're not setting ourselves ambitious enough targets. I should acknowledge Netherlands' leadership on this. You know, they've been champions on it for years. But there is an accountability mechanism where the donors get together with NGOs. At the beginning, those NGOs were almost exclusively Global North NGOs. The donors were Global North NGOs. That is changing. It's a more inclusive group now, but it's not changing fast enough. And we do need to be held accountable more. On your second point, you know, we know the evidence shows that using local actors in a meaningful way in producing, involved in evaluations in particular, leads to better outcomes. We're trying to do that more systematically, but again, we're just not doing enough of it, and we need to get better at it.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was, really well-rounded response. And I hope that answered some of your points, Youssef. And just to say, keep the questions coming. We will have another round of questions, but for the moment, we're going to focus on some concrete recommendations. So we're going to do a round with our panelists on concrete recommendations. and look at what change needs to happen in the way that local and Indigenous knowledge is being formed, brokered, translated and managed to make it more meaningful to the humanitarian decision and policymakers. So Zaki, can you tell us a little bit about impact when research and evidence are not informed by global South actors?
Thank you very much, Madeline. I'll try to be concise on it, but maybe I'll need to split it in maybe 3 parts. First part, let me very quickly, like overall, like, I mean, if the Global South partners are not engaged in the research, it has 2 dimensions of implications. One is to the, when you are conducting the research, there are some implications over there. And the second part is the findings and the recommendations coming out of that research is having implication. And what are those implications? These are mainly what I have seen in my experience. And I'll also acknowledge, like, I mean, a partner coming from Global North, maybe it's very difficult for them to understand the context of that particular country or area. Maybe they haven't worked before, or they have limited work. And there's so many, I mean, there's so much diversity. Like, I take my our own country, Pakistan, from the language perspective, from the religion perspective, from the cultural customs, food, everything. It's so diversified. It's even for us, I mean, sitting here, it's so diversified. Maybe in some part of the country, we don't have that exclusive context that what's happening and how the people behave or how the people react, or and even availability of services. So acknowledging this, that that it's maybe not possible. So for the partners in the North, and if they are doing it research without having a good space for the local partner, so what happens, maybe during the research they will find issues, challenges for the local partners when they are going out to collect the data, because the methodology was not informed by the Global South partner. For example, in our context, in many parts of the country, you can engage very well qualified women, but you can't bring them out of their own district, let's say for the training purposes. If you are doing a centralized training alone, then you need to take care of their chaperone. You need to provide them all the logistic that you are providing to your primary this researcher. You want to train them. Maybe when you are going out in some part of our country, over there, these huge lands are owned by the landlords, and the people who are residing there, maybe for decades, they don't own their that land, that house, even the agriculture field, everything is owned by that landlord. So if you are collecting the data from that particular area, maybe this guy himself, that landlord, or maybe someone from that landlord, you need to talk to him first. You need to engage him before you go out and collect the data from those villages. Because if you don't do it, maybe the villagers can participate in your assessment, but maybe it can put them in a harm way later on. Maybe speaking to women. So if you are going out to speak to a woman as a respondent, maybe it's in our culture, it's better that you include in your approach that you will be speaking to a man first, just to get them on board. Because you don't want the woman to be put in harm. Maybe she participate in your survey, in your assessment, your study. So these are different. And then maybe when you are providing recommendations. So now I'm moving to the analysis and recommendation part of it. So if it's so diverse, the country, where in some areas you have the, let's say if it's livelihood opportunities, in some areas it's one set of livelihood opportunities that's more feasible as compared to some other part of the country. So maybe if you are providing a recommendation for a study which is covering maybe different parts of the country, and you are not taking the context from your local partner, maybe you are providing a recommendation which are not applicable to all the areas that the study is conducted. Maybe it's true, and maybe that finding is coming from one set of respondents in some part of the country. So in a nutshell, your key findings, conclusions, and recommendations could be weak, could not be, not applicable, if you are not taking the inputs, the right inputs from your Global South partner. Now, what can be done? I'll quickly touch base on it. I'm looking at the time as well. One way is to having a long-term partnerships. As again, and I don't want to quote it again because Hague is kind of hosting this, but like, I mean, we are having this long-term relationship. So once you build this relationship, there's a trust there. The partners know each other, and slowly and gradually they can give you more and more space as well, the right deserved space to the local partners. And this way, not only your research methodology is improved and strengthened, but also your findings and recommendations are actually, I mean, these are robust and doable. The other way, other thing we have seen is doing the analysis workshops. We are also part of some of the other organizations where after the data collection, the international partners and us, and when I say us, it's not like the key people from the organization, but actually the field researchers, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were part of those analysis workshops, just to try to better understand what does it mean? I mean, if the findings coming up, what does it actually mean? So, and what should be our recommendations? So taking all this input. So one other way is having those analysis sort of workshops in our researches where the local partner from the Global South and the international partners come together and they analyze the data and findings together, and then framing the recommendations accordingly. As I said, long-term multi-year partnerships could be also a good way of addressing some of those challenges. So yeah, so I'll just stop here. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Zaki, and thank you for talking about, I guess, some of those practical impacts, which are very real in terms of doing no harm to communities, and as well as some of the recommendations that have gone with it. I'm actually going to go to Pak Puji next, just to ask you, Pak Puji, what are some of your concrete recommendations that you would like to encourage donors and intermediaries to pick up on?
Thank you, Madeline. From my side, I think listening to what Johanaka was saying, the honest observation and research that was undertaken, I think the concrete recommendation that I could think of really is break out of the rank and pick up the courage for the donors and do the walk in the, how to say, less traveled path, is that right? Do the unusual, essentially, Johanaka. And really open up the perspective. One is in terms of setting the agenda and prioritization. I've been part of this grand bargain for a year as a Sherpa. And one of my takeaways, essentially, is I feel that the donors, to a certain extent, has been held hostage by the intermediaries. I understand, like what Christine was saying, that the accountability is to taxpayers and parliamentarian investment. And as Johanaka was saying, your eyes and ears are essentially represented by intermediaries. And that perspective could be skewed, could be biased, could be self-aggrandizing lessons. And many of the findings from Global South may have not been admissible. But Center have been in a position of having 2 researches, which findings are not pleasant, and they never get published by the one who commissioned the work. This is reality. But beyond that, Madeline, I have my younger colleague in Bujano Center, and I would like to give her the limelight. Wendy, if you pick up some of the recommendation for intermediaries and donors, please.
Yes,
if you allow
Papuji.
me, Madeline. There you go.
Thanks,
Yes.
Puji.
Hi, Madeline. I'm Winnie. Nice meeting you. I just would like to make it short. I would like to address 3 points briefly. I believe some of them are already mentioned by all of the panelists here, but I would like to highlight it once again. 3 of the recommendations. In this case, intermediaries are INGOs and also corporates. That now more and more these corporates manage the programs, which traditionally have been usually managed and delivered by INGOs. And the first recommendation is that the INGOs and corporates can design their research and evaluation together hand in hand with the Global South actors. Of course, incorporate their voices and credibility and make sure that these actors are also engaged and led in knowledge sharing and production. I believe it's already mentioned by Ms. Catherine Gill. And therefore, the intermediaries do not produce any research or evaluation on behalf of the Global South actors. They are no more pictured merely as the beneficiaries, but also as the champions, as the actors. I also would like to mention one example. Once again, it was mentioned already by Mr. Zaki that Mr. Aliester, about the community of practice, which could be established in order to find more voices from Global South actors, especially those who are at the grassroots level. The second recommendation is that they should implement equitable visibility with their Global South actors in research outputs. It also includes the acknowledging their involvement. One thing to do is to put simple little thing, I know, to put logos in the publications and the final products of any documentations. It is also expected that INGOs and all corporates foster a culture of learning through reflection and improvement. For example, it can be done through a real-time learning session. In this case, experiences and lessons learned, which are conducted and collected by the Global South, can be emerged and occurred, which are from the field. This could be, and this must be documented well, and I believe it could be very useful for any actors, INGOs, corporates, Global South actors themselves, governments, anyone, or other possible holders to learn from the field. Further, sometimes INGOs and corporates it is the thing that I would like to say, it's related to the feasibility. INGOs and corporates sometimes only follow the rules and requirements from the donor agencies related to feasibility aspects of the program. Still, it will be great to add logos. Once again, it's just a little thing, a little issues, but it can be a tool to voice out their aspirations. The logos of the Global South actors into their documents, even though maybe this thing is not a mandatory thing for INGOs and corporates. And the third one is about to have an operational arrangements of the flexible funding and flexible time frame. Therefore, the Global South actors can lead and shape the research process, and they're not limited by the predetermined agendas and priorities. And of course, this might require the capacity building by providing training and resources to build the skills and expertise of the Global South actors. At the end, the result is to address power imbalance and biases in the knowledge production process, and to ensure once again that the Global South actors have equal opportunities to participate and to lead. I think that's all, Madeline. Thank you very much. Over to you, Pak Puji and Madeline.
Thank you so much, Wenan. They were really concise recommendations, so great to have them. I'll just go to Johannika. And we've talked about challenges and ways of delivering equitable research processes. What would your message to the audience be on change that we should be creating in the sector to ensure local and Indigenous knowledge and voices are not only recognised, but are shaping decision-making processes?
Yes, thank you, Madeline. Well, my advice would be firstly an advice to the donors, and I think, and my own agency as well. And I would think that investing in meaningful long-term partnerships with local knowledge institutes, universities, in-country consultants in the South would be, a first measure to take. And then the other, it would also mean changing our practices. So, for example, we really should make a point of always including local knowledge in the development of terms of references. And, for example, including local knowledge in your reference group. That's something we did in the end, but it was only, one voice. So it's also you have an issue of representation there as well. So think of reference group members, and then I'm triggered also by Pucci, who talked about the donors are held hostage by the intermediaries, and I would agree to a certain extent that that's a difficulty. And something we see not only in the evaluations area, but also in the program implementation area, where, for example, a big donor as the Netherlands is dependent on intermediaries to implement their programs. But what we are, piloting now is basically to look for new mechanisms of participation to bridge the gap between the global north and the global south. So to try and look for yearly meetings with a representation of local voices around the world to look at priorities and to discuss, independent of any evaluation or a specific program, to look at how you can do this better and what we need to learn from the past year. So basically to grip the gap between the Dutch policymakers sitting in The Hague and local partners in the global south. There are all kinds of issues there as well, like who is representative enough, like to for the whole global south. How do you do that with? But I think we're slowly starting to take some steps to bridge that gap. Yes, but I think we're not there yet. I think we have a lot of terrain to cover, and we need to. So one of the things that we need to hold ourselves, but also our intermediary partners to account. And I'll tell you that the biggest challenge there is the UN agencies. It's not so much the Red Cross, it's not so much the NGOs who are very near to us in The Hague, and we have like a very thorough dialogue with them on what we expect from them on localization, including on budgeting for the right things and making sure that local partners get their say in what's in the program. But I feel like we're still taking baby steps.
Thank you so much, Johannika. And thanks. There's been a couple of questions in the chat, and thanks to Catherine for responding, because we are running a bit low on time. So I will just ask you, Catherine, why do you think equitable knowledge and evidence practices are important in decision-making?
Thanks, Madeline. To me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, we're humanitarians. We've got principles of equity, impartiality. We're about empowering communities. So it's entirely consistent with that. As evidence makers, if I'm providing advice or signing off on investments, you want to know that you're putting the right resources into the right places and working in the right way. And we know that we can assure ourselves of that if we're drawing on local knowledge. One point I would probably emphasize, and maybe I haven't talked about it enough, is as public servants, we're often thinking about evidence-based policy, and evidence is fine to a point, but what's really important is the political economy analysis. And if we're just looking at data and practice without understanding what's the political context, in this context, how are decisions made, who holds the power, who's making those decisions, so I think that's also really important. And again, that's only going to be coming from local voices who really understand that local context. I think my takeaway in working in this space for a while is that local leaders, local communities often have knowledge that's key to solutions in the humanitarian system, and particularly if we're thinking about around, increasing disaster risk in the Asia Pacific, but we're just not always giving them the opportunity to and the resources to share that knowledge. I was really taken by Pak Puji's point about the intermediaries, and I agree, in a diplomatic way with Johannika. Africa that, you know, we have some robust discussions with the UN partners. It's not always easy. We would like to work more directly, but frankly, with economies of scale, it's just not feasible for us to work at scale everywhere with local partners more directly. But we do want to increasingly take the path less travelled, and I think for Australia anyway, particularly in our region, we are finding opportunities in the Asia Pacific to not work through intermediaries but be working more directly with local partners to foster, you know, their knowledge production, and for us to then draw on that knowledge production. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Some of those points really rung true. Like, I think the political economy is a really important point that we can't underestimate, and how it impacts, you know, localization and knowledge production and everything. So I think that was a really great sum up. I'm just going to check if there's any final questions before we wrap up, because we are getting to the end of our time. So just any final points? I did also want to ask, while we might be waiting for those points, just on any insights that you might take from this session or past sessions that can support your work, to post in the chat. That would be really great. We have been trying to do a survey after all these sessions, but it's been hard to get people to jump on and do that. So we're really interested in if anyone can share insights on these sessions with us. We do also have a quick poll, and I think Pam, you'll pop it up. And we'd just ask everyone in the audience to quickly fill out this poll. It shouldn't take more than 30 seconds. In the meantime, any other final comments from our panelists? I know Pak Puji, you came off mute.
Okay. Right. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Three quick things. First, I think part of the mea culpa, it's my fault. So self-admission. We in the Global South have not been very good in organizing ourselves. So I could empathize with Johaneke and Catherine. It's so difficult to identify who is representing Global South. This is part of what I call the constituent building of the otherwise ethereal Global South. You know, it's after all, it's a half of the globe, and yet we need to build this constituent and representation eventually, so that we could engage at the eye level with the donors, and hopefully without going through I'm not going to mention the dirty word there, but without going through intermediaries. That's one. Number two, Catherine and Joanna, we haven't talked about this, but talking about the nexus of humanitarian development, I would not underestimate the role of the foreign missions in the country. They are the one, after all, that hold the huge portfolio of development cooperation, right? We from the humanitarian sectors holding small envelope and jockeying for space when time is crowded. But our colleagues from the development mission, the foreign mission, have ample time and energy to build the partnership with us in the Global South, which in time of need you could cultivate for the operation and for research. So that's second point. And the third one and final one, I think, is that, as it was said by Wenny, it would have been easy for the donors to look for and cherry pick the partners that are viable and fit into your criteria. But we are so diverse in the Global South. That being said, I think it is quite legitimate for the donors to set aside funding and support to build and invest on local actors so that they become your viable partner when needed. So these are three recommendations and insights that I have right now. Over to you, Madeline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Puji. That's a great wrap up. And just in terms of wrapping up as well with some key takeaways, currently knowledge in the humanitarian sector is dominated by the global north. Therefore, if we want to pursue effective policies in humanitarian reform, knowledge and evidence needs to be grounded in the global south. So how can we support local knowledge to find its way to the policymakers? How does policy interact with knowledge? There is still a technocratic view that knowledge and research is going to lead to reform, and there is no power or politics involved, but this is a myth. How can we make sure policy meaningfully engages with knowledge at the right level? And then finally, we need to invest more on non-conventional knowledge and nurture the global conversations along this line. We need to be careful on the topics we are researching, be aware of who will benefit from the research, and talk to the people whose lives will be affected by the research. We need to establish the progressive change in methodology for humanitarian knowledge development and management. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to sharing more ideas in future sessions. Thanks to all our panelists as well.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.